James Lytton wrote a piece called Reminiscences, which is about the Battle of Manila, February 3rd to March 3rd, 1945. When I read it, it was quite touching for me, and in seeking him out and other possible speakers on the topic, I attended many of the lectures that were related to the 70th anniversary this year in February. From UST, there was a whole load of survivors that came back to go to UST and recount their years there. To the Filipinas Heritage Library, where there's been also a series of lectures. One thing that really struck me was that in those lectures that I realized most of the survivors now speaking were young or were children then during the war. Now it may seem ghoulish of me to say this, but after their generation, there will be no next generation that lived and suffered and survived the war. In our library, with 20,000 volumes of rare and first edition Filipiniano material, the titles we have, whose authors are still alive, may be up to several hundred. To give life to our books, I established on an ongoing basis a monthly lecture by an author whose book is in our collection. I want the author to speak about the creative process in writing, on developing a story, on inspiring aspiring writers to hear the speakers, the authors, speak about what they wrote and how they wrote it. I want that our library of books come to life with authors whose works we have and authors are still alive. Now, 70 years later, it's even more crucial to hear the survivors speak about what they went through. The makings of a citizen include a knowledge of one's past, its tribulations and triumphs. If we don't know this past, how can we exalt who we are and therefore exercise citizenship? I thank Mr. Lytton for having come to speak to us about his life during those most trying months 70 years ago. In the process, we will learn how human beings in a crisis can actually resolve to survive, help others, and pick up when the worst was over. In so doing, we may learn to love our country more and to engage in it as citizens. Mr. Lytton.
First of all, my thanks to the Ortigas Library for inviting me here. I am, of course, overwhelmed by the presence of Dr. Benito Legarda, who is the utmost authority when it comes to this period of our history. And I'm surprised that he came here to listen to me, because it was he who 6 years ago twisted my arm and forced me to write an article, but it was published in the Philippines Free Press. And of course, I'm glad that J.J. Calero is here. He was my contemporary in LaSalle before and during the war. His older brother was a very good friend of mine who now lives in Australia. And the rest of you, thank you for coming. I am definitely flattered that anyone would be interested in listening to me. Now, I have to take out some pieces of paper here. Now, I'm not going to read what I'm going to say, but I do have some notes that I may have to refer to. Earlier, I remember I was booked as someone who was supposed to give a lecture. I'm definitely not going to give a lecture. I don't have the scholarship or the ability to give a lecture. Call me a storyteller. I came here to tell a story of a preteen young Filipino boy who was born before the war, savored the period when Manila was called the Pearl of the Orient, and rightly so, and then 3 years of Japanese occupation, which the young child was very difficult to understand, but painful in any way. And then, of course, the post-war years. Now, a bit of my biography. I am the 6th child out of 8 of George Lytton Sr., and Rosa Tulud. My father is a British Eurasian. My mother is from Dinalupihan, Bataan. How they met and raised a family would be another interesting story. Anyway, I was born in 1933 at the old St. Luke's Hospital, which was in Santa Cruz. This was an Episcopalian hospital. And the doctor that assisted my delivery, I remember, was a Dr. Steinmetz. I understand he came from the U.S. Army, left the U.S. Army, and set up a practice here. My father's family at that time lived in Robert Street in Pasay. And Dewey Boulevard had not yet reached Robert Street. The Dewey Boulevard is reclaimed area. And the front of the house, my sisters tell me, was a beach. And they would often go to the beach. But very near Roberts was the Philippine Nautical School, which site is now occupied by the Department of Foreign Affairs. And my sisters would sometimes joke and say, you know, this Philippine Nautical School must be a school for naughty boys. Why would they call it nautical school? Of course, they didn't understand what nautical school meant. And then shortly, about after 2 or 3 years, my parents moved to a street in Ermita in Calle, Oregon. And in 1936, my father bought the house left by the estate of the Moreta patriarch. This was in the corner of Isaac Peral and Florida Street, which is now UN Avenue and Emma Rosa. Now, you will notice I just mentioned 2 American states, Oregon and Florida. Ermita at that time, well, I understand Daniel Burnham had a hand in planning Ermita, had a lot of streets named after American states. I remember Dakota, Nebraska, Tennessee, Carolina, Pennsylvania, California,
Vermont.
Colorado,
Vermont.
yes, Vermont. That's where the old doctor's hospital was. And these were named after the states that sent volunteer troops to fight in what American historians call the Philippine insurrection, but which Filipino historians would rather call the Philippine War of Independence. And the neutrals would say just the Philippine-American War. And Ermita, in the words of Carmen Guerrero Dapil, was a quaint, idyllic place to live in. It had a population that was very cosmopolitan. They had a lot of Europeans, but mostly Spanish. And the Spanish influence in Ermita was still very, very evident. The doctors had shingles that described them as cirujano, medico cirujano, physician surgeon. And a lot of houses had signs which said, cuidado por los perros, beware of dogs. Beware of dogs. And we called our house help a male, muchacho, a female, muchacha. And hard to believe, even the menus in Chinese restaurants were in Spanish. Our immediate neighbors were the 2 Moreta brothers. Dr. Rafael Moreta was in the corner of Sacral and Churuca, and behind us was Emilio Moreta, who had about 12 or 14 children, as I remember, 9 of whom joined the priesthood and nuns. But the eldest Moreta boy suddenly disappeared. And there were also other Spanish boys that left Ermita, and we found out later on that they left the Philippines to join the forces of Franco. There was a civil war going on in Spain, and a lot of the Spanish boys here joined the forces of Franco. Now, I would say that Isaac Peral at that time was the most beautiful street in Manila. The most beautiful street. Yes, it was lined by huge acacia trees whose overreaching branches formed a cave-like bower. So if you came from Taft Avenue and you went towards Dewey Boulevard, I still call it Dewey Boulevard, you would feel like you were going through a cave, a tunnel of leaves. And at the end of Dewey Boulevard, of course, you will hit the Elks Club and the Army-Navy Club. And in front of the Elks Club would be the Miramar Apartments, the Bel Air Apartments, the University Club in the corner, which became Shelbourne later on, and the Lynette Hotel, which still exists. And another landmark that I can't forget is Wallace Field. You know, the eastern part of what is now Rizal Park was just open space, open space. It was reserved by Daniel Burnham to be the site of the government center. And as a matter of fact, they had already built 3 government buildings there: the legislature, the Department of Agriculture, and Finance. But I understand the money that was appropriated for the rest of the buildings was spent somewhere else. So it remained an open field. It was called Wallace Field. Now, I've often wondered, even after the war, who the heck was Wallace? You know, why was it called Wallace Field? And this is what I found out. Wallace Field was named apparently after a certain George W. Wallace, 2nd Lieutenant, 9th U.S. Infantry. He came from Colorado and was awarded on June 25, 1900, the Congressional Medal of Honor for bravery in a battle that took place in a town called Pinuba, wherever that is. I don't know where. I think it's in La Union, because in Zambales there is a Wallace Air Depot also. Anyway, Wallace Field was wide open, and it was a place that we went to often as kids. We had a gang there in that area to play. I was enrolled in LaSalle in 1938. LaSalle is a Christian Brothers school on Taft Avenue. I have to mention this because it will have some relation to what I'll say later. LaSalle was staffed by American and Irish brothers. The brothers took holy orders, but they could not say Mass. But they took the vow of obedience, poverty, and chastity. Now, when I was in the 2nd grade, this was around 1939, 1940, all of a sudden the old brothers disappeared. And we had new brothers who were all Germans. And we were wondering why in the world, where did the other brothers go, and why are there Germans here? The German brothers were a bit stricter. As a matter of fact, there was one who was Mutford William, that's his name. He was called the Gestapo. My teacher, who was Brother Felix, an American, was replaced by a Brother Anthony, who had a scar on his face, and it was rumored that he got the scar dueling. You know, the German college kids would duel. I mention this because the fact that the Germans arrived showed that they became enemy aliens when England and Germany went to war. The German brothers in Hong Kong, Malaysia, and other British colonies became enemy aliens. They were sent to Manila because America was still not at war, and the American brothers maybe were sent there. Now, we now come to December 7, 1941, if I may. December 8 is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. It's a holiday of obligation for us LaSalle boys. You have to go to Mass under pains of mortal sin, and preferably receive Holy Communion. So December 7, I slept early. We had to fast at that time. If you wanted to receive a Holy Communion, you had to fast. No water, no drinks. But instead of waking up at 6 o'clock as I had planned, I was awakened at 4. There was a commotion in the house. People were running about, and I heard people say, Pearl Harbor has been bombed. There's a war, there's a war. Didn't mean much to me. Didn't mean much to me, except that my father didn't allow me to go to church. People were warned. Now, yes, the strict blackout was imposed immediately. And there were blackout wardens roaming the streets. If they see a light, they would throw a stone or blow their whistle. Strict blackout was affected. And people began using words that sort of enriched my vocabulary overnight. I heard the word shrapnel, air raid shelter, and very often the word evacuate, which a lot of people pronounce evacuate, because the Japanese began to bomb the Cavite Navy Yard, Nichols Field, Fort William McKinley. They even bombed boats that were anchored along the Pasig River. And the inaccuracy of their bombing hit the Santo Domingo Church, if I'm not mistaken, in Intramuros. That was the first casualty as far as churches go. So we made arrangements to evacuate to Antipolo. We traveled at night, no lights on, and we were able to lease a house along Antipolo. And I remember our immediate neighbor there was the Diaz family. The Diaz, whose daughter became the wife of Doy Laurel. Celia. Well, we stayed there for about, I don't know how long, but we would get news from Manila. We got news that Manila was declared an open city. But then one day, my brother Edward, who was an ROTC cadet at UP because he was there pre-med, got notice that his ROTC unit was being mobilized. And so he had to go to Manila to join his ROTC unit. My father had to buy him shoes, get him a mosquito net, some pants, khaki pants. And that's only an indication of how unprepared and how under-equipped the Philippine Army was. The injury was, well, insult was added to injury, if I may say so, when General Blumel during the Bataan campaign said, the Filipino soldier is only good for two things, saluting and demanding 3 meals a day. I don't think he was referring to the Philippine Scouts, because the Philippine Scouts did most of the fighting. They were the elite troops in Bataan, and they were housed in Fort William McKinley. And if you will recall, the barrios around Guadalupe now have names like Rembo, Embo, and it always ends with an Embo. The Embo refers to enlisted men's barrio. That's where the families of the Philippine Scouts lived. The Embo stood for enlisted men's barrio. Anyway, after a week, my brother came back to Antipolo. We were all so happy. We asked what happened. How come you didn't go to where you were supposed to go? Well, they boarded a truck. They were on the way to Bataan. But by the time they got to Kalumpit, the bridge had been blown up. They couldn't cross the Kalumpit River. So they all had to turn back. That saved my brother's life, I think, because he was not a very healthy person. By the way, his daughter is right here, Edwina. That's your dad. But we were so happy that he was back. We were so happy that the Kalumpit Bridge was blown up. And maybe a week or so later, we learned that the Japanese had arrived in Manila. It was occupied, and we could go back. We did go back. We still had some gasoline in our cars, and you could still buy gasoline in certain places. And when we arrived in our house, we were surprised to find all of the UP campus occupied by Japanese soldiers. And the hotel behind our house was also occupied by Japanese soldiers. They just took houses as they needed it. But the whole of UP campus was occupied by the Japanese. Now the UP campus then, the University of the Philippines campus then, was the whole block that was bordered on the east by Taft Avenue, on the south by Padre Faura, on the west by Calle Florida, which is now Amorosa, and on the north by Sacral. And right beside, across the UP campus and across our house, was the Episcopalian Cathedral of St. Mary and St. John. It was an old, well, it was a, I wouldn't say it's old, it's not that old, but it looked old to me. The architecture is typical of maybe the cathedrals of Middle Ages.
No, Santa Barbara.
Of Santa Barbara.
Mission.
Yeah.
California Mission.
Yeah.
And anyway, they had an Ifugao gardener who kept the garden clean. And we would often play there. But we never dared enter the cathedral. Because Archbishop Doherty, if you remember him, Dr. Lagarda, made a pronouncement that it is a mortal sin for any Catholic boy to enter a Protestant church or even go to the YMCA. But I violated that rule many times. So now we now now come to the Japanese era. What I remember are just pictures and scenes. I remember the Japanese soldier walking streets with about 5 wristwatches on his arm. I understand that these wristwatches were confiscated from death marchers, soldiers who surrendered, and maybe from civilians who were wearing watches that this Japanese liked. The Japanese soldier was in uniform always. They had a cloth cap that had shades, cloth shades at the back, and they had leggings, and boots that had small round spikes that made a grating noise when they walked. Now you could tell an officer from a private by the sword that he carried. All the officers carried a sword, and the compulsory order to bow now became very prevalent, because if you meet a Japanese officer, you're supposed to stop and bow, not just by bowing your head, but from your waist down. Otherwise, you get slapped. That was a common behavior of the Japanese. Whenever they didn't like anything that anyone did, they would go on a slapping spree, and he would be shouting, "Vaquero, vaquero," which I understand means stupid, stupid. And I got to learn that the Japanese soldier didn't wear the traditional underwear that we wear, because very often they would open the hydrants in the streets, and they would all just take a bath there, naked except for the G-string that they wore. So, now, what did people do, as I recall, during the war? Movies were shown. A lot of movies were being shown. Of course, some movies could not be shown. But I remember seeing The Wizard of Oz at Gaiety Theater. I remember seeing Diana Durbin in Times Theater. And the Filipino movies was revived. A lot of Tagalog movies were being shown. And to make movie going more interesting, a lot of movie houses introduced vaudeville. This was live shows. And one of the more popular actors who appeared in these live shows is Pogo and Togo. our equivalent of Laurel and Hardy, or Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. And they were once arrested by the Japanese for a skit that they made. In this skit, Pogo, or one of them, comes in with about 5 watches in his arm. And they have a conversation. Pogo asked Togo, what did the Spaniards bring to the Philippines? And Togo would say, well, religion. How about the Americans? Education. And the Japanese? Racion. Rationing, because food was getting so scarce. Now, the streets of Manila began to be filled with beggars, with swollen legs. My brother Edward told me that is called elephantitis in medical terms. They had a lot of tropical ulcers. They would fight over garbage just to get something to eat. Now, our house was diagonally across UP, and every morning the Japanese would take their garbage out. And there would be a crowd waiting for this garbage to come out, because whatever could be saved or eaten were mobbed. One day, I was a witness to this. I was looking down from my balcony, and one of the beggars, a thin, tall man, must have done something wrong, because a Japanese came out, short, stocky, and he had a wooden sword, and he began to beat this man with this wooden sword until the man fell down and died. He must have died. But that's how life began to deteriorate. And I think the turning point, the worst point, occurred shortly after a very strong rainstorm in November of 1943. I think it rained for 5 or 6 days, and all of Manila was flooded. Isaac Peral was waist high. And life became even more difficult then. The Japanese money, which It was printed shortly after occupation. You had to surrender your Philippine money. It became almost useless. You had to bring a whole basket full of money just to buy something at the market. And of course, there occurred now a black market for what was called genuine or genuine money, as the Philippines called it, genuine money. People were hoarding the Commonwealth money, those issued by PNB, because they knew that the Japanese money was becoming useless. Now, the Battle of Manila, the date for the Battle of Manila is supposed to have started on February 3, when elements 17th Infantry crashed into the gates of Santo Tomas. But I think it started really earlier.
First Cavalry.
The first cavalry, yes. I really think it started earlier. It started, in my opinion, on September 21, 1944. I was in Wallace Field with my friend, and we were playing there. We saw some airplanes in the sky. We thought they were in practice maneuvers, until one burst into flames. And then we saw airplanes diving almost 90 degrees down and releasing what appeared to be 3 black objects. Now this was no practice. We immediately ran to my friend's hotel, that was the Queen's Hotel right in San Luis, and hid in their air raid shelter. Almost everybody then who had a yard had an air raid shelter. An air raid shelter is just an excavation of earth with 2 entrances topped by, say, strong beams, and then earth. We stayed there for about an hour. The air raid was about an hour, and this was an American air raid. This was the first return of Americans to Manila, September 21, 1944, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, as I recall. And every time the air raid siren would ring, we would all go up to our roof garden. We had a roof garden to watch the air raid. It was the air raids were not something to be feared. It's something that we welcomed and we anticipated and enjoyed. And one day we saw a very unusual plane. This was it was a plane that had 2 fuselages connected in the middle by the cockpit. And later on we found out that this was the P-38. So somebody who was in the Army said, this means that these planes are now coming from a landing field because they're not aircraft carrier planes. So the Americans are really coming nearer and nearer now. Now, around that time, 2 tragic incidents occurred, which I will now relate. The first one was around, I don't know the exact date, but it was around maybe November. There was an air raid. We went up to our roof garden, and from the east we could hear an American airplane coming down, but the noise, the sound of its propeller was different. We felt that it was in trouble, and we could see it then. And all of a sudden, a bomb came out of its bomb bay, and we thought it was going to fall directly at us. But it went over the acacia trees and hit the house of Dr. Luis Guerrero. It killed the son, Dr. Luisito Guerrero, and 3 maiden aunts, according to Carmen Guerrero Napil. The second tragic incident took place, I know the date, January 8, 1945. It was early morning. There was, all of a sudden, there was a raid of 4 propellered airplanes with twin tails. Later on, we found out that these were B-24s. They were coming in from the east. No, they were coming in from the southwest, going towards the east. And as usual, the anti-aircraft of the Japanese began to be activated, and the skies would be darkened by the explosion, black explosion, mushroom type, which would rain shrapnel to the ground, and which we kids would collect. You know, we would always compare. I have more shrapnel than you have more shrapnel than he has. Anyway, an American intern at UST was also watching this, and I'd like to read to you his observation, because something tragic happened here. His name is Stagner. I forgot his first name. He goes, and I quote, my younger 10-year-old brother Lawrence and I were crouched under our shanty, and we could hear the roar of the approaching bomb group and the loud cracks of bursting enemy AA. Like a couple of nitwits, we stood outside and in awe of the approaching B-24s. with puffs of the outburst all about the flight. I definitely observed a flash and an AA burst under a trailing bomber. A tiny red glow was then observed under the bomber and began generating a long, slender trail of brown smoke. As the B-24 neared, the flames began to grow much larger and thicker. Shortly after the stricken bomb passed, it suddenly went in a sudden dive to the right and away from the group. I witnessed and felt a horrendous explosion when the B-24 where the word B-24 should have been. I was able to observe only 3 men with shoes. One was at a much higher altitude, and what I considered normally open. This man was rapidly drifting back towards the target. Yes. The 2 other parachutists went west. We lost sight of him, but the single parachutist came towards us, and we could see the man. He was quite near us. And when his figure was already quite visible, we heard gunshots. The Japanese were shooting this man. This parachutist was being shot by the Japanese. And he fell, according to a witness, where Plaza Ferguson, in Plaza Ferguson, they changed the name to Plaza Ferguson. Now it's something else. But the witnesses said that he was still alive when he fell and he was taken by the Japanese. And Sasha Jean Weinsheimer, the daughter of the Canlubang estate owner, when she came back here years ago, or even before she came back, did some research on this airplane, which I shall relate later. Now, I think it was around December or January of 1945, when the Japanese began to build obstructions in the streets. They began to put cement poles strung with barbed wires. And what we saw ominous and odd is that they would dig holes and they would place artillery shells with the fuse sticking out. You know, so I suppose this became anti-tank mines, because if a tank went over the fuse of an artillery shell or a bomb, it would certainly explode. And without as much as saying please, they entered our house and dug a pillbox. Our house was situated in the corner. They dug a pillbox. Now a pillbox is not a pill. It's not a box for pills. It's actually a fortification. It's a fortification. They dug a hole, about maybe, not a hole, a trench. They placed steel plates on top, then cloth, and then they dug horizontal holes on our cement fence, where they stuck what appeared to be high caliber guns. They were magazine fed. And this went on in many streets, Life was getting really very difficult in Lagos then. Hardly anyone went out the streets. And on February 3, evening February 3, my father got a call from a relative in the north, in Santa Cruz, to say that the Americans were there. You know, this was February 3, 1945, and the telephones were still working. Because after the war, it took me 8 years to get a phone. But this was wartime, the eve of the return of the Americans, and the telephones were still working. And everybody was excited because we knew that liberation would be near. But the next day our hopes were dashed because we heard loud explosions to the north. It turned out the Japanese were blowing up all the bridges. The Jones, Santa Cruz Bridge, which later became MacArthur, Quezon Bridge, Ayala Bridge. And they blew up the Santa Ana Bridge. And shelling started at around 2 or 3 days later. We would first be visited by a Piper Cub. You know, the Piper Cub was a single propeller plane. It was an observation plane. They would come, go around. And the thing that we found odd was the insignia on the Piper Cub, because we were used to the old American insignia of a round ball, white with a blue star and a red ball in the middle. This one now had a white star with two white bars on the side. But as soon as the Piper Cub left, a shelling would begin. Shelling would begin. Now, being on the way of a shell is like standing in front of a freight train coming straight at you. You could hear that sound that it makes, which would end in a deafening explosion. What was odd is that the shells were hitting civilian targets, civilian homes. Dr. Moreta's house was hit by 2 shells. The house behind us was hit by 2 shells. And then about 2 or 3 days later, electricity were cut off. The evening darkness was suddenly lit by fires all over the place. The Japanese had begun setting fire to the houses in Ermita. Setting fire. So our house was a concrete house, but it was occupied partly by the Japanese with that pillbox. But a lot of people whose houses burned came to our house, and we couldn't say no. I mean, these are people who need desperate help. So in the evening of February 9, we had about 100 people in our house. And the one I remember most was a fellow named David Graham, because he had a younger sister who was my playmate, married in Ugarte, lived in Cebu, and I think she's still alive. Anyway, early in the morning, the Japanese captain, we didn't know that they were Marines. We couldn't tell a Marine from a non-Marine, came to the house and said that we all had to leave. We all had to leave. Gave us 1 hour to leave. The elders in the family came together and planned where to go. Where should we go? The only 2 places that they thought we could go to would be the Ateneo, which was at the end of Florida Street at Padre Fara, or the Philippine General Hospital. They were situated side by side, separated by a wall. But the 1 hour was not allowed. The captain came back in 30 minutes and told us we all had to leave. We all had to leave. And they placed a machine gun in front of our door. I don't know what that would have been for. Nobody was armed. And we left one by one. They didn't leave us. They didn't allow us to leave en masse. They made us leave one by one, because as we left, the Japanese would open the bags, the handbags of the people there. They would steal the watches, or if you had an earring, they would get it. I remember an old lady with a handbag whose handbag was searched by the Japanese sentry, and he found some Japanese notes, Japanese, and he took it. And I was wondering where he could spend this money, but he took it anyway. So we left and we walked towards Florida Street, going to the PGH or the Ateneo. We walked as we got out. We didn't walk in mass, because the Japanese were searching everyone that was leaving. And I was walking alone. I had my mother was slightly to my right. To my left was my brother George, and slightly ahead of me to my left was a young 15-year-old girl. Her name was Narda Pangan. She was from Dinalupian, Bataan. She was staying with us because she was studying, and she was carrying a basket on her head. And as I was walking through Florida Street, I sort of got into some daydream, because I remember it was right there in Arkansas Street, they changed the name now, which is opposite the Court of Appeals building, where a Japanese sentry was stationed. And as I passed him, I heard a shrill "kura kura." I must have done something wrong. I remember I didn't stop to bow. So I went back and I bowed, and he told me to go away. This sort of daydreaming was suddenly interrupted by an ear-splitting explosion. There was an ear-splitting explosion to my left, to my right. When the dust settled, I saw a corpse, a body with legless. 2 legs were gone. Left arm was gone. The blood was spilling on the dust, coagulating there. And this person was still moaning. And I couldn't figure out who this person was. Must have been a woman. And it turned out it was Narda, 15-year-old girl who was walking ahead of me. She had stepped on a landmine. And when I looked to my right, my mother was laying on the road, unconscious. Her left arm was all riddled with shrapnel and stone. It's a good thing that this was about 11 o'clock and the sun was still a bit to the west. She was holding on to a fan, maybe, to shade her face from the sun, and it was her left arm that got most of the blast. My brother Edward, Edwina's father, who was a medical student, he came immediately to the rescue. But then somebody panicked and said, "Run, run, save your life, save your life." And people began to just run, threw away everything they were carrying. I ran as fast as I could. I must have broken the 100-meter dash because I entered the PGH through a small gate. There was a roadway to the PGH, and I think I was one of the first ones there. But then there was a Japanese sentry that took it upon himself to close the gate and to lock it. I knew where he got the padlock, so those coming after couldn't enter. They had to enter the Ateneo. But to get to the PGH to bring my mother for medical help, they had to go over a fence, cement fence. And fortunately, there was a ladder, a wooden ladder. And it took all the efforts of my brother and 3 other men to bring my mother over the ladder. And the doctors at PGH did their best. They placed a pair of plaster casts on her left arm, which was fractured. Her eye was bleeding because it was hit by splintered stones. And she was placed on a bed on the 2nd floor ward. Now, the PGH was built in 1909 or 1907 by William Parsons. The same, I think William Parsons belonged to the staff of Daniel Burnham. He's the same architect who built the Manila Hotel. And it was built in such a way that you could take advantage of all the fresh air that was available. It wasn't a solid block. It was more like a rectangle, empty inside, crisscrossed by additional buildings for pavilions, etc. So it created a lot of inner courtyards. And it had a crawl space. Now, a lot of buildings in Manila before the war, especially concrete buildings, the first floor was always built about a meter above ground. So you had crawl space. And that crawl space would be home for us for about 5 days later on. And we first sought shelter at the nurse's home. Those of us who found each other, my brother Edward saw to it that he was with my mother all the time, and so did my sister Emma. And Edward, my brother, who was a medical student, would also go to another ward to see how my brother George was doing, because the landmine blast sort of blinded him. He couldn't see. So we stayed at the nurse's home, which is still there, except that at that time it only had 2 stories and a roof garden. Now it's 3 stories and a roof garden. One of the Merita girls who was with us said that we should stay in the toilet, in the bathroom, because it's made of concrete and it was the safest place to be in. So we spent the whole night in a toilet, all huddled together. Hungry, but what's worse was being thirsty. You know, thirst is I described it as like a feral spirit stuck in your throat, you know, demanding to be satisfied. It will drive you crazy, being thirsty. Now I can understand why some of the Bataan Death Marchers would break line just to go to a Carabao pool to drink the dirty water there, because thirst will drive you mad. At 4 o'clock in the morning, nobody could sleep because of thirst. My cousin Anselmo came with water in a can that had formerly contained peaches. I could still see the label. And I was told to take only a sip. But I didn't obey him. I took a whole gulp. Later on, I found out, because I was wondering, where did this water came from? I found out that he had taken this water from the flush tank of a flush toilet in the nurse's home. not the water inside, but from the tank. But you would drink anything if you're that thirsty. Early in the morning, another Japanese officer came and told us all to leave the nurses' home. We had to leave. I don't know how we got there, but we ended up on the second floor of the south wing of the PGH. It was a room full of internal organs preserved in bottles. I could see livers, hearts, and all these things. It was the only place we could go to. But outside the window, I could see an artesian well. There was an artesian well being pumped by some people who dared go there. Because you took your life at risk to go there. It was open air. You could be hit by an American shell or by snipers from the Japanese snipers who were at the Bureau of Science building. Again, no food and no water. I was very curious to see my mother, so I asked where I could find her. I did. She was in a single bed in a ward south. If you face the PGH, there's a second floor ward in the south. She was moaning. She was in pain, but my father was there and he was smoking. I was surprised that my father was smoking. Where did he get the cigarettes? It seemed that he had saved some cigarettes, Lucky Strikes, I remember. And before the war, you could buy cigarettes in cans. You could buy cigarettes in cans, and he had a can of Lucky Strikes. He was an inveterate smoker. You know, there was a young Filipino there who saw my father smoking, and this fellow was also an inveterate smoker. And he made a deal with my father. He says, "Look, one cigarette, I'll go to the institution well and get you 2 bottles of water." Deal done. So this fellow, nicotine addiction to nicotine, gave me my second taste of water after 2 days of being so thirsty. Now, my brother Edwina's father, did most of the work there. We owe him a lot. He was taking care of my mother, was taking care of my brother, and he thought that where we were was not safe enough. And by chance, he met an old friend, a fellow named Ed Kang. Ed Kang, yeah. Who was from Cebu, came to Manila doing some business here, but was also wanted by the Kainta because he was a guerrilla. And Ed Kang also brought his family to the PGH. And both of them together sought a safer place for all of us. And Ed Kang said, you know, the safest place here, I think, would be the ante-room to the elevator shaft. The PGH at that time only had one elevator. And it had the bottom floor had an ante-room which was about 40 square meters. And it was, of course, surrounded by concrete. So my brother and the Kang family moved there. My mother was carried and brought there. And I was accompanied by my sister and brought there. And as I was going down the stairs, Mrs. Kang, to whom I will be forever grateful, gave me a cup of rice with Chinese Tausi black beans in it. Did I devour that? And I think that's the best meal I've ever had and will ever have. You know, when you're that hungry, anything is good. But that was really good. And so we stayed there at the ante-room of the elevator shaft. We were safe from shelling. Now, the shells that were coming in wasn't making the kind of noise that we were used to. Somebody said this must be mortar shells because that means the Americans are near. These are not the howitzer shells. These are not artillery shells. Because the noise was slightly different. It was sometimes noiseless, but we would know that they would be mortar shells because when we go out, we would still see the fins on the ground. You know, the mortar shell had multiple fins. So that means the Americans were near. And then in this ante-room of the elevator shaft, there was also an opening that led to the space, yeah, the space between the ground and the first floor, and there were openings there. We could see a firefight going on between American troops and the Japanese that were holed up in the dispensary building. And this went on for about 1 day. and the PGH itself was being hit by what we thought were shells from tanks. That means the Americans were right there. They were right there. They were already fighting room to room. And January 17, which was a Saturday, started with a little shelling in the morning, then absolute quiet. Eerie silence at about 10 o'clock. We were wondering, why is it so silent? And then from far away we could hear a noise, people shouting. Then it became louder and louder and louder, and we could hear people saying, Americano! Americano! The Americans had arrived, they had arrived. I peeked out, and there was an old lady with me. We saw an American leaning on the railings, and the old lady told me, baka hindi Amerikano yan, mukhang Aleman. In English, she said, he doesn't look like an American, he looks like a German. Well, you can't blame us, because the Americans that we knew wore what was called the soup plate helmets of World War I. They wore khaki. Their arms were either Garans or Springfields. But this American had a helmet that was very different from what we knew. He was wearing a herringbone twill fatigue. He had a gun that I wish I had, small, but it turned out to be a carbine, a magazine-fed carbine. But when he spoke, then we knew he was an American. And later on, I think, if I recall his accent well, he must have come from Brooklyn. And we were liberated. You know, I cannot describe the happiness I felt. If there is a heaven, I think I was in heaven. Happiness was bursting from my chest. I was shouting. I wanted to shout, I'm alive, I'm alive. We're all alive. We're safe. We're all alive except that my mother was badly hurt. And then word came that we should leave the hospital as soon as possible because the Japanese might counterattack, because they were just across the street at the University of the Philippines. That's just one road away. But ambulances came, American ambulances came, and they took the more seriously wounded. My mother was taken by an ambulance. My brother Edward wanted to go with her because he was medical student, he was not allowed. So my mother was taken away, we don't know where they went. But we were told to leave the hospital right away. So the hospital was like an anthill, people coming out by the hundreds. And as I came out of the main entrance, slightly to the left, I saw the body of a dead Japanese. And right behind me was an elderly man who took a stone the size of a small ball, and with all his might threw it at this dead Japanese, accompanied with the traditional Tagalog expletive, which had referenced the reputation of the dead man's mother. I mean, the hatred for the Japanese dead was so intense that I never thought I would see a Japanese in the Philippines again. It was so intense. So we all went out. We crossed Taft Avenue. There wasn't a single building in Taft Avenue that I saw that was standing. It was all razed, bombed, not a single building. And we went through Calle Oregon, which is now, I think, Apacible. They changed the name. And not knowing where to go. My grandmother was carrying my first cousin, who was only a 7-year-old baby. He was crying all the time. They were all thirsty. So was I. So my grandmother said, get us some water, get us some water. I saw an American. He seemed like an officer because he had a sidearm. And I asked him, could you give us some water? And he took out his canteen, gave it to me. And when I returned it to him, it was empty. But I'll never forget the kindness of that man. We were all thirsty, and he gave us his whole canteen. And we finally found each other because my elder sister found an abandoned house in General Luna. It was abandoned. We all got together there. But the front lines was just very near. You know, day and night, tanks would be coming. The first time I saw a Sherman tank, I was shocked at the size of the tank, because the tanks that I remember seeing were Japanese tanks and Stuart tanks that were miniatures compared to Sherman tank. And I was so, how would you call it, aghast at the size of the stand. And half-tracks with mounted howitzers would be coming in every day, going out, maybe going to the front lines. And I don't know where we found the rice, but we got some rice. And some GIs would give us their part of their K rations. That's why I could never eat Spam anymore, because their K rations always contained Spam. And I got so tired of Spam. I can't eat Spam anymore. And they were kind enough to share their K rations with us. And for the first time, we were eating at least one meal a day. And 2 doors down, Henry Luna was a well dug by somebody. There was water, but we didn't know how safe the water was. We took the water, boiled it, and drank it. And we also used it to take a bath. I took a bath for the first time in 10 days. But I was still wearing my old clothes because I had no new clothes. So, I befriended a GI there. His name was Salves, S-A-L-V-S. He's from New Hartford, Connecticut. And when I went to New Hartford, Connecticut sometime, I tried to look him up, but unfortunately he wasn't there. Anyway, he was a great storyteller. And while we were talking to him in the street, we suddenly heard a shriek of a shell. We all dove to the ground. He stood up and was just laughing at us. He said, "That's an outgoing shell. That's not incoming." He could tell from the sound of that the shell makes whether it's coming, incoming, or outgoing. Anyway, my father decided that we should go to the north of Manila. He had a house in Santa Cruz, in Calle Adonel. So we all packed up whatever little we had, and we walked. I remember walking until we reached the Pacos rail station. It was still there, beautiful as it is, but pockmarked with shell marks. And then we walked another hour or so until we reached Pandacan, where the Nagtahan Bridge is now. And I thought that we would have to cross the river by Bangka, because I couldn't see any bridge until we got near the shore, and I saw a fantastic engineering construction. This was a pontoon bridge. You know, this was a bridge made from rubber rafts that was placed side by side until it reached the other end, and on top of it were placed perforated steel where jeeps could go through. I don't think it would carry a tank. And it had a side platform where pedestrians could walk. So we walked over that bridge, which later on became the Nagtahan Bridge. We reached the Carriedo Rotonda, I remember. And then we went to Calle Legarda. Was that named after your folks?
Great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather. Until we hit Ascaraga, which is now Recto, turned right, and then turned right again in is that Rizal Avenue?
Yeah.
Until we got to Sorbaran. But on the way, we could see a lot of kids mobbing American soldiers with their traditional greeting of Victory Joe. One something Joe. I'm afraid to use the words that they actually used. Okay, you say it, pom pom. And there were a lot of bars had just popped up like mushrooms. But what I can't forget was the music that I heard. I heard "You Are My Sunshine" being played. And as long as I live, I will never forget that song. Because it was so popular then, and it was followed by another song sung by the Mills Brothers called "I'm Going to Buy a Paper Doll That I Can Call My Own."
Paper doll.
You know, those two songs I will never forget. Now, this is 70 years ago. 70 years ago. And you know, the memories of war, of death, rotting flesh, is still fresh in my mind. When my folks went back to our house in Sacral, everything had been looted. Even the toilet fixtures were gone. I understand the Filipino looters were even ahead of the American troops.
Yeah.
In some areas. My father's safe was blown up, and there were about 6 or 7 dead soldiers, Japanese soldiers, still there. I don't know, the American Army had a Graves division for their dead, but the Japanese dead were left where they were. And invariably, the mouths of these Japanese soldiers were open because the Filipinos would get pliers to extract their gold teeth. And invariably, they had no shoes. The shoes would be the first ones taken. And as I say, 70 years have passed, and in many unguarded moments, the horrors of war still sometimes come to my mind unbidden. There are times when I dream of it. I remember Mrs. Kang, the one who shared her food with us. And 3 years ago, we visited her. She lives in Osami City. She died about 2 years ago. She had 2 sons when we were in the PGH. She now has 6. Her husband predeceased her. I remember that B-24 that was shut down. And when Sasha, Jean, Weinsheimer, Jansen came to Manila, she had told me that she had done some research on that plane. And she found out that it came from the Moluccas.
Molokai. Molokai.
Molokai.
Molokai.
Molokai.
Molokai.
Mototai.
Molokai.
Okay, I'll have to do it for it. And it had the serial number 4440533. And it belonged to the 3rd 307th Bombardment Group that called itself the Long Rangers. The Long Rangers. And it was piloted by Second Lieutenant D. Lucy. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant William O. Goodlaw. All of them were killed. And according to Sasha, their remains are now in the American cemetery, which means that their remains had been found. But the one I remember most is that poor 15-year-old girl, Narda, the one who sat in the landmine. Because she had such great promise. She was a very bright girl. She was always top of her class. She came to Manila to study. She was at the Philippine Women's University High School, which had an extension division in Ermita, near the Ermita Church. And she was always the top of her class. You know, she was the daughter of a poor sharecropper family. And if she had lived, she could have become a lawyer or a doctor because she was bright. She taught herself English. She read a lot. Only to be killed by a landmine at the age of 15. Now I don't know whatever happened to her remains. She has no grave, no grave. Until Memorare Manila 1945, I think, put up this memorial in Intramuros. If you have time, I think you should see it. It's very similar to Michelangelo's Pietà. It shows a woman holding a dead child and children strewn about her who are suffering or dying. It's a memorial to the 100,000 civilians who were killed during the war. And recently, in the last commemoration, they put 2 plaques that showed the sites where the massacres took place. Now, we were liberated in February 17, not knowing that on February 17, a massacre took place at the house of Dr. Moreta. There was a terrible massacre there. And when I was in that laboratory full of internal organs, on February 12, a massacre was taking place at La Salle. All the German brothers were killed, and all the civilians were killed. The only survivor was Brother Anthony, who was my teacher in the 2nd grade, the one that had a scar here, and Father Cosgrave. But among the brothers, only Brother Anthony was the survivor. He hid behind the chapel, And of course, Brother Alphonse, another German, survived because he was in Baguio taking care of the La Salle vacation house. Now, Brother Anthony was sent to California to recuperate and to teach, only to be killed by a hit-and-run vehicle. Imagine that, surviving the massacre at La Salle, only to die in California by a hit-and-run vehicle. But it's the other that's always in my mind. You know, it was such a waste. No grave, no gravestone to remember her by, until Memorare built this this memorial in Intramuros, which is really a gravestone for all the missing, those whose bodies can no longer be found. It says, this memorial is dedicated to all those innocent victims of war, many of whom went nameless and unknown to a common grave, or even never knew a grave at all, their bodies having been consumed by fire or crushed to dust beneath the rubble of ruins. Let this monument be the gravestone for each and every one of the over 100,000 men, women, children, and infants killed in Manila during the Battle of Liberation on February 3 to March 3, 1945. We have not forgotten them, nor shall we ever forget. May they rest in peace as part now the sacred ground of the city, the Manila of our affection. Thank you.